I finally got the chance to sit down and play through Final Fantasy XVI, and I really enjoyed my time with it. It's far from perfect, but it's one of those games that really sunk its hooks into me, so I ended up playing it for about 10 hours or more a day for a week straight until I completed it. I somehow managed to go into this game completely blind other than what was shown in that first reveal trailer and bits of that story preview video at one of those state of plays. I also managed to dodge practically all discussion of this game, so I didn't know if there would be bits people felt where the game dips in quality or anything. It was great to finally get to play a new Final Fantasy game again and be completely detached from all the hype, build-up, and discussion. It's at times like this where it reminds me how nice it can be to live under a rock and be detached from it all. I want to get my negatives out of the way first so I can gush about what I like so much about Final Fantasy XVI. Spoilers ahead if you have not played this game, expect me to talk about literally everything. This first segment is going to be only about the base game. At the time of writing and recording this, I have not played the first DLC and the second DLC is not out yet, so if you haven't played those yet, you're perfectly safe for spoilers from those. And I also want to add a second addendum that this segment about the base game is going to be on the version of the game that was before the major patch with the release of the second DLC. There were enough changes in those patch notes that if you played the game after the second DLC's release, like if you're someone who is on PC, you are playing a fundamentally different game than I did. So there are going to be complaints about that game that I played that are no longer in it, which will be addressed in the DLC segments. Chapters for these segments are marked in the description below. Sadly, the biggest thing that I took issue with is the moment-to-moment combat and its implementation in certain areas. Final Fantasy XVI exists in this awkward middle ground of a character action game and an RPG, which ends up hurting the final product. I would have really liked it if they had fully leaned into making an action game, because the combat often really bored me. Enemies with bloated health bars, large enemies and bosses just not reacting to your attacks at all, restrictive combo ceilings, selective ability limits at any given time and their cooldowns, the lock-on struggling to pick high priority targets when you need to kill healers in the background, the list goes on. I played up until the time skip on the give me an action game difficulty and constantly felt like fights would go on way too long due to their health bars despite having the best in slot gear at the time and enemies not being complex enough to warrant how long it took you to fight them. The real deal breaker for me was the dragon before the Typhon fight, which has like 3 to 5 moves, so the fight gets stale super fast yet goes on for 15 minutes. Once I bumped it down to the give me a story difficulty, the encounters still felt piss easy as they had been up until this point on the action game mode, but I just got through them faster instead of having to stagger the enemy 6 times and wail on their downed corpse before they would reanimate. This still happened plenty of times even on the easier difficulty, especially near the end game, where specialty hunts and mini-bosses take so long to kill in unresponsive sponge fests. The only time that I thought it was fair that this was happening was when I fought the level 50 dragon at level 39 because I was too impatient to do this hunt and I wanted its materials so I could make the gold items. Like, yeah, I don't expect to be dealing good damage to a boss that is 11 levels higher than me. The fact your launcher is tied to your dog by pressing down on the D-pad also makes combat a lot less fluid feeling, since there is often a delay and sometimes he even decides to just spike the enemy down before you can even trick up to do an air combo. Anything that has a stagger bar can't even be launched or done an air combo on anyway. They pretty much ignore everything you do to them unless they are staggered, or if their stagger meter is at 50% and you instantly use the Garuda ability on them to pull them to the ground for a few seconds. I don't know why you would put a Royal Guard counter move in this game if large enemies are just going to completely ignore it when you actually activate it against them and still hit you dealing damage. Anything with a stagger bar can't even be launched anyways, so after a while I just kind of forgot about commanding Torgal and trying to do any stylish air combat because it doesn't matter, and the game actively stops you from doing it. All of your AI party members that fight alongside you also become completely useless anytime you fight larger enemies or bosses, as I discovered that they don't actually deal any damage to them. They make the health and stagger bars glow, but they don't actually move, or if they do move, it's so minute that I can't easily tell this while standing still like I did right on screen now. This is likely another contributing factor to why fights feel like they take so long in some cases. Like, yeah, you can sit in the void all day with the enemy invincibility setting and the no ability cooldown settings on and combo people to the end of fucking time, but that's not what the actual game is like. The fictional game that combo mads with these settings make FF16 look like is the game that I do want to play. I want that, but that's not what this is. What the game actually feels like is if you are thrown into an arena with a bunch of Empusa queens on Dante Must Die in DMC5. The bloated health bars wouldn't even be that big of a deal, especially on action game mode, if you could actually juggle anything with a stagger bar. I would not be complaining about any of the things I just mentioned if the game gave me more ability to interact with the enemies I'm fighting. As it is now, anytime I would fight these enemies, it just really takes me out of the moment. My proposed solution is that even if they were hell-bent on keeping the meter on these enemies, maybe they could have made it so it was easier to break said meter, and when you did this, it would allow you to juggle enemies. Kinda like how enemy stun values work in DMC3's DMD mode. I'd be fine if it wasn't even a permanent thing and it was only for a short period of time, kinda like the downed state. They could make it so enemies break out of your combo with a revenge value like it is in Kingdom Hearts 2. Because I kept putting this video on the back burner, taking longer and longer to actually eventually come out, Clive ended up getting announced and put into Tekken 8, and just in his combat preview trailer alone, it showed him being able to do more combos than he can in his own game. My enjoyment of the combat system did massively increase once I got Odin's abilities, but he's the last icon you inherit and the game is practically over at this point. By now I have long since lost the interest of trying to do crazy combos. If me saying that is going to make you think that I wasn't engaging with the combat system and being fair to the game, I'm sorry, but maybe the game shouldn't have locked the thing that I found the most fun behind 37 hours of gameplay. This isn't a 10-hour action game a la Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, so at this point I'd be about 7 hours in, and the levels are short and really replayable. This is a 50-hour RPG, so I think it's really unreasonable to expect me to want to do a New Game Plus as soon as I finish it, just so I can get actual use out of these cool abilities. You get a ton of abilities from the icons you absorb, but you only have 2 ability slots and 3 active icons you can swap between. This meant that there were just a lot of moves that ended up getting ignored because I had the few that I really liked and rocked for most of the game, and I wasn't not gonna have them for something that is more niche or I didn't like as much, which in turn ends up bottlenecking your complete move list, since kinda like DMC stance abilities, the icons have an ability on circle like Royal Guard, Trickster, Swordmaster, and Gunslinger. You end up having to make concessions for the movement options you like the most, so you have to decide, well, if I want Trick and Royal Guard, then I'm gonna have to give up Snatch, which is on Garuda, since my 3rd icon slot is being dedicated to Remove right now because I really like their 2 active abilities. I think they look cool and they seem to deal a lot of damage, which I like, but I really dislike the shot lock on Circle. I thought it felt like shit, so I just have to have an ability that I do not like over one that I do, because if I'm going to make a pick, it's going to be 2 abilities I like over 1 ability I like. It becomes somehow an even worse version of DMC Devil May Cry's Dante's move list, where if you played any of the previous 4 Devil May Cry games, this Dante's analogs to those games' move lists is spread across all of his weapons instead of being a cohesive single character. FF16 basically just says, alright, you hate that system? What if we add a extra layer of restriction to this, where you're only allowed to have 1 demon weapon and 1 angel weapon, and you can only change them in the pause menu and not during combat. Eventually you do get the opportunity to mix and match icon abilities with different icons once you master said ability, but it isn't until late game where you're starting to get a real steady high amount of XP points for upgrades. I am glad that this is an option that I do get eventually, and the ability to reset your allocations of points at any point in the game is also super convenient, but I wish I just got to it faster. Even once you start drowning in upgrade points, they quickly disappear and are eaten up if you want to move the super move abilities, the ones that are like scripted animations and kinda like what you'd imagine are summons in a traditional Final Fantasy. It costs like 10,000 points to move any of the late game ones off of their icon. I want to use all the abilities these icons have to offer, but for some reason they decided to just only allow you to use 2 and relegate them to square and triangle, even though you have to hold the right trigger to even activate them, meaning that X and circle get left as their standard actions of jump and unique icon trait. Why couldn't they make it so all 4 face buttons get used when you hold the right trigger? Stranger of Paradise does this, and that would make it so you can go from having 6 abilities to having 12. It seems like an obvious thing to do because in the menu you see the 4 icon abilities laid out in a diamond. They plan to add Leviathan in the 2nd DLC, so it's going to add at least another 4 abilities to the 30 you already have, so why give you only 6 ability slots? Especially when combat moves that vary up your move list have to share the same slots as big fuck off AoE cutscene abilities that deal massive amounts of damage, which the game constantly pushes you as the thing they want you to always always be doing off cooldown. I hope they end up making this change and let you have more active icons, at the very least an even 4, or make it an upgrade that you can have all of the icons equipped at once in post-game like DMC5 did, where you can equip all the weapons on Dante. I don't expect this to happen, but if it did, it would make the combat much more interesting and enjoyable. As it is now, when you are fighting basic enemies which die in a few hits, you end up just spamming your abilities when they are off cooldown until you stagger the targets. Then while they are down, you rotate through all 6 of your abilities, and if any of them are sadly still on cooldown, which a lot of the big damage ones and the super moves have super long cooldowns, you're stuck just hitting them with your singular 4-hit melee combo. Why couldn't we at least have gotten a melee combo B? Something more than pressing square 4 times or alternating between square and triangle to weave in these small little spell shots that don't feel smooth at all? By the time I reached endgame, I just felt like I was going through the motions with combat encounters. So I went and cross-referenced other people's Let's Plays from around this area, and a bunch of them have at least 3 icon super moves, which I tried to avoid because it felt like I was just watching the same cutscenes over and over again as if they were summons in a traditional JRPG. Sadly, these seem to be the best way to deal huge damage, so even I conceded and used at least 2 to just speed things up while still being able to stay active and taking part in the combat. If you are going in expecting DMC cross Final Fantasy or DMC 5-2, you are going to be disappointed. And to anyone who says that's an unfair comparison, the combat designer of DMC 5 literally worked on this game, and 90% of the move list in Final Fantasy 16 has a direct analog to moves in DMC 5. It's similar to how I felt about the newly released Slave Zero X, where I wished they gave the player more freedom in gameplay, instead of feeling like there's a ceiling for combo variety, since the game seemingly feels like it was meant to be played a very specific way and doesn't allow for that much deviation from that mold. Give me the chance to slot in more abilities at once. That's really all I want. I don't expect you to allow me to just turn off ability cooldowns during regular gameplay, or adding in pause combos, even if I would love if they did this. On the topic of the very intrusive ability cooldowns which hampers combo variety, if they were so worried about people spamming the icon skills without cooldowns, maybe they could have gone for the Dragon's Dogma approach, where each vocation skill requires a bit of stamina meter. Basic combo stuff would not be tied to this meter, just like it is in Dragon's Dogma. It would be strictly for the special icon moves. You could even make it MP in this game to keep the RPG roots. Maybe have some MP regen mechanics, so it doesn't end up slowing the gameplay down to a complete halt if it possibly made it worse than the current system already in place. The game already kinda does this with the shitty accessory system, which has a bunch of unique, mostly minor, but unique nonetheless, gameplay modifiers. An upcoming action game, Tides of Annihilation, is trying this Dragon's Dogma stamina meter approach to its special moves, seemingly to balance its summons. I can't say for certain how well it works out in that game since it's not out yet, but I do think it's something that would be worth experimenting. It should go without saying that I think that having no cooldowns would be the best option, but I'm trying to meet them in the middle and see what they were going for. The next 2 issues go hand in hand with each other, and that's the open world level design and quest design. 85% of the quests in this game are the yellow quests from Final Fantasy XIV you ignore and walk past every time you see them, unless you are an absolute degenerate and have nothing left to do in that game because you've played it for 7,000 hours and have bled the stone dry and are now crying that the game you have spent almost an entire year's worth of hours doing nothing but playing is now boring. These involve you talking to a random NPC who needs you to run to the grocery store to get you their 7 shit potatoes, or heading out to Flint, Michigan to kill Grognar the Impaler, who is sending them mean letters in the mail. You go to the marker on your map, grab the requested item or fight whatever's holding it, or kill the requested amount of shit mobs you've been doing nothing but killing all game, then return to the NPC to complete the quest. These wouldn't be so bad if the maps weren't so barren and boring to explore. There is zero reason to go anywhere unless you're told to do so. The few times I did explore, I found areas that would later be shit potato quests and found a box with a whopping 10 gil in it. 10 gil to add to the 4 million that I have because there's nothing to spend it on besides healing items that are dirt cheap. There was only a single time I had to spend skill on anything that wasn't a potion, and that was for the 5 crafting material that I didn't have 50 for to make my new item. The world of Final Fantasy XVI is a bunch of hallways they've obfuscated with barren wastelands with nothing in or anything to do in them. If you walk off the roads, you will just find a bunch of trash mobs you've killed by the 1,000 already, more basic crafting shit that you don't need, or literal pennies. It just feels like a waste of time when you can't just teleport to the objective because it is so boring and slow to trot your way to it. Even when you get your chocobo back, it doesn't speed things up nearly as much as I would have hoped. As I've mentioned time and time again in previous videos, linearity isn't an issue by itself. The fact that the game is basically hallways in a barren wasteland would not be an issue if the zones themselves had actually anything entertaining to do in them and if you could traverse them faster. And to anyone saying that the hunt log is something that you can do in the overworld, yeah, those show up every once in a while, and there are a few boss fights of the same enemies you've been fighting all game, now with an even more bloated health bar. That does not account for the 99% of the rest of the entire game's world map that they do not occupy, or the 99% of the time that they don't exist in the game. As it is, I would rather just have the mission select system of Stranger of Paradise, because that didn't feel like it was wasting my time and cut all the chaff. It was straight to the point and I appreciated it for it. The other option is to make a much more interesting and rewarding world to explore. Having played this and Dragon's Dogma 2 back to back is really eye-opening when one has such an interesting world to get lost in and the other feels like an afterthought, begrudgingly put in place, when a linear mission structure would have suited this game far better, at least in the context of what content is currently here. It is only at the 11th hour, right as you are at the doorstep of the final boss, does the game give you most of the best side quests. There are some good ones sprinkled throughout the game, which kept me curious enough to check every single one out, and apparently you have to do all of the boring ones to even get the good side quests to spawn at the end of the game, from what my friends told me. This same friend described the good side quests as Mass Effect loyalty missions, and I think that's perfectly apt. They just had me going, man, these are really good, I wish all the side quests were this good, but most of them aren't. And with how the game is written, you can't even cut most of them out of the game, because you need these shit potato quests as setup for characters and events that will be paid off 25 plus hours later in the satisfying and good loyalty missions. You get a lot of touching and great emotional moments for these characters, catharsis, massive payoffs to things that have been building up for this whole game, but to get to it, you have to do boring shit. This brings me to my last complaint with the game, and that is the pacing. The pacing for most of this game is either good to alright, but then it starts to have too much time wasting filler between the interesting bits. I understand the story can't always be at an 11, there has to be rising and falling actions between the peaks, that is just basic storytelling, but this is the same issue that FF14 also suffers from, so I guess this is just the team's writing style. Since playing the base game of Final Fantasy XVI in March of 2024, I have gone through and played all of Final Fantasy XIV from where I fell off in the middle of Heavensward back in 2022, all the way to the end of current content in Dawntrail waiting for the 7.1 expansion update. So I know full well that yeah, this is just how they write stories. 16 is very similarly paced to the expansions in FF14 that I think have the most pacing issues, that being Heavensward and Dawntrail. Like how in Heavensward, where we are having all of this cool political drama and espionage while trying to stop the Dragon Song War, only to then spend 10 hours on Moogle Mountain to help these furball fuckers find their magical toenail clipper that they left on a mountain and go get this guy his grilled cheese he left on a rock somewhere. Then you get back to the interesting stuff with Hraesvelgr, only to spend another 5 hours helping goblins. These segments in FF16 became really repetitive and boring as shit, and it doesn't help that they are all structured the same way every single time. Most of them are you get to a new town and then there's a checkpoint or a roadblock and you have to spend the next 2 to 3 hours doing shit potato quests for new characters before you can go on your merry way. The first time is in Northreach helping out the Dame. I thought this area was interesting and it led to 2 of my favorite non-loyalty mission styled side quests with the wolf and the farm girl. This area is so uncomfortable and has this perfect dread-inducing music to accompany it.
Up, the lot of you. There's still work to be done.
You heard me. Shift your asses.
The area is like that pumpkin patch episode in Over the Garden Wall, except everyone actually is insane and evil here. Then you do this again in Dalima and it's fine. It introduces some fun characters and you get to spend some quality time with your uncle. This is where I started to notice this pattern of boring build up to peak set pieces. Then by the third time they do this shit with Gotez getting his pass stolen, I was like, oh, can we get on with this shit already? The few shitty pace breakers that deviate from this formula is when Sid's kid shows up.
There he is. All right, Clive.
And then you have to spend like an hour or two helping her build her airship with all of her boring ass fetch quests. This does in turn make all of the big boss fights and set pieces even hyper, but man, the game overstays its welcome by like 15 hours near the end. It reinforces my feeling that the perfect length for a game is 20 to 30 hours max if you're trying to tell a big story, because otherwise they often just start to lose steam and meander. Okay, with this stuff now out of the way, we can get to my gushing, which will probably not seem like a lot compared to my complaining I just did, because it is simply easier to write in great detail what you dislike about something rather than what you like. The music in FF16 is just mwah. The sound design in general is just all around great. Like I already mentioned earlier, it instills dread with its oppressive droning in the countryside. It gets you hype when the music swells perfectly. It makes you pop off when it elevates cool moments with its well-timed stingers. The tracks themselves are so fun to listen to. Masayoshi Soken, you are the GOAT. Favorite tracks off the top of my head are the songs that play during Titan Lost versus Bahamut and everything during the finale. The performances are really good. I don't know where they found some of these dudes, but they sound so cool. I wish I sounded like Sid. One of my favorite bits narratively is when Clive finally is face to face with his mother again right before the Bahamut fight. This is the woman who betrayed you, sold out your entire family, someone who should have shown you endless love and compassion, sold you into slavery, killed your father and her husband, and confronted with the weight of her sins that she can no longer run away from, it is revealed how pathetic and shallow her motives truly were. You would have likely have believed that she had some grand ambition or evil motive behind everything awful she has done, and by extension enabled by selling out her family and nation to the Empire. This woman single-handedly ruined an uncountable amount of people's lives. While all of the blame doesn't solely fall on her, she does play a major part and has a major hand in throwing the world into chaos, propagate war for her own gain, and subjugates most of the population while she sits in her ivory tower. Her husband was actively trying to make the world a better place, a world where the branded and people without magic abilities could coexist peacefully and equally, and she got his head cut off for it. Clive perfectly embodies the player's reaction here in essentially going, that's it? That's the reason you destabilized most of the world and killed your family for? And then she kills herself and dies with little fanfare, a perfectly pathetic end to a completely pathetic, shallow, and self-absorbed person. One of the few times the anticlimactic ending to a villain is actually really satisfying, and probably the better and more satisfying outcome than Clive simply killing her. She is the more interesting and well-executed villain of this game compared to Ultima. I'm of the opinion that they should have never made him speak English, he should have spoke gibberish the entire time. I hate to use this phrase because it's such a meme now, but he lost so much aura once you're able to understand what he is saying. It's leagues more imposing when the eldritch entity from beyond the stars is completely ununderstandable and you have no idea what their goal is, because the reality of the matter is that his goal is a lot less interesting and a lot less personal and a lot less impactful compared to Clive's mother. For him, it was a tragic case of the mystery was far more interesting than the answer. The worst thing that Ultima did was explain his reasoning and motives. As soon as he did that, he became a lot less interesting and a lot more lame. Hot take, I know that interpersonal drama is much more appealing than end of the world, I need to steal your body and shoot a blue laser in the sky plot. The action set pieces and kaiju fights feel like what Bayonetta 3 wishes its demon sequences felt like, and is the sequel to Azura's Wrath we deserve. Yoshi P and his team tricked everyone into thinking they were getting Game of Thrones Final Fantasy, and instead gave us the coolest tokusatsu and kaiju game to maybe ever come out. It only makes it sting more more that Kamiya left Platinum and we are probably never going to see Project GG, and if by some miracle we do, it likely won't be his original vision. Fights like Titan Lost and Bahamut are what makes the bits that drag worth sitting through. They've got me filled with boundless joy and whimsy playing through them. It's what makes this game so frustrating in places because the peaks are so high, only to be stalled out by boring quest design and pace-breaking story segments. So like the opening of the video mentioned, this segment on the DLCs is and was made months removed of the previous segment. I had originally beaten the game back in March of 2024 before the second DLC had come out. I wanted to wait until it was released before making the video as a complete package. A combination of multiple things ended up leading me to putting the video on the back burner despite having the first segment basically done, other than a few bits of editing that needed to be added in. So this incompleted version just collected dust on the Patreon for a few months, which, by the way, if you want to see other videos like that, a link to my Patreon is in the description below. But now, having gone and played those DLCs with the update that dropped in April of 2024, which tackled a lot of things that I complained about in the base game segment, it has me more conflicted because on one hand, it's nice that I could address those changes, and on the other, it sucks that I pretty much played an inferior version of the game than those who either started with the PC version or played the game after April 2024, further cementing that it's not worth playing games until like 2 years after their release when they stop getting support and updates, and the wait for the DLCs wasn't worth it because I did not like Echoes of the Fallen or The Rising Tide. Let's start by covering the bigger changes to the game that the patch brought, which tackles my complaints. To cut down on time wasting in the barren and boring open world, you can now quick warp back to quest givers once you complete the quest. This cuts down on so much time on traversing the boring and contentless world, especially some of those extremely large later areas in the game. I would have loved to see how much time mathematically this would have cut down from my playthrough if I was able to just warp back from the beginning. They added an option for custom button layouts, which is great, and the one that had me the most excited was the addition of skill sets for icons. Initially, when I heard this, I thought you'd be able to set multiple skill layouts that you can alternate between on the fly, which is technically what this update adds, but to me, it's fucking pointless because you can't swap during combat. All of this does is allow you to not have to fiddle around in the menus as much when you want to change icons around. I just don't understand these half steps they keep on doing with the combat in this game. Why keep adding these restrictions to hamper fun and creativity? That's it for the major changes via the patches that aren't strictly new content, so let's get into these DLCs with me saying that they weren't worth the price of admission or the time I waited for them. Listen, I really love the base game, but these two DLCs feel very reminiscent of the type of DLC that came out from big AAA games during the 7th generation. DLCs that were often set before the end of the game at some unspecific point of time in the story, with the setup of here's another adventure you missed out on but are now seeing. They usually have some light sprinklings of new lore but nothing major, and are mainly there to give you more of what you've already seen. A vehicle to give you the same core gameplay loop with a new toy or two against a new enemy type or two. Stuff like Dead Space 2's Severed, Gears 3's Ram Shadow, Mass Effect 3's Leviathan. Unlike massive expansions styled post-release content like the Shivering Isles, Undead Nightmare, or Dark Arisen, they're usually a 2-ish hour-long mission pack with maybe a single level gimmick that makes them kinda memorable. I recently played through Ram Shadow for a Gears of War video, and it reminded me of how forgettable and disappointing DLCs like this were at the time. You ate them up because you wanted more content of the games you liked, but they were often not very good. A whole lot of nothing burger that goes nowhere really, and that's what both of these Final Fantasy XVI DLCs ended up feeling like to me. The first one, Echoes of the Fallen, has the gang investigate a tower which turns out to be housing Omega. Sigma's design is really cool, but this is mostly just a few hallways of combat encounters, an FF14 raid boss shittily repurposed for an action game, and the Omega fight itself. I'm sorry, but if I wanted to wail on an unresponsive giant enemy boss while dodging glowing red floors, I would just play FF14, which I already have 2,000 hours in. I don't need fights like that in an action game where there is a lot more player expression in movement and combat compared to a tab-targeting MMO. You get new gear here, but who cares about that because it doesn't do anything but increase stat numbers that mean fuck all and require no effort to work for, as they are either right in front of you in a box or slightly out of the corner off the beaten path. The expansion is mostly a straight line, which wouldn't be an issue if the combat hadn't long since gotten stale with enemies that don't feel at all different from the ones present in the base game. The visuals of some enemies like Sigma, who I already mentioned, the Omicron mini-boss, and Omega are really the only highlights of this otherwise completely forgettable DLC. It felt like something that was cut from the base game due to time and repackaged later for $10. Which brings me to DLC 2, The Rising Tide. While I think it is better than the previous DLC, my criticism of it feeling like main game content they couldn't finish in time also applies here. This DLC, on the other hand, was $20, and I don't know what is in The Rising Tide for it to get off on charging you an extra $10 compared to the previous Nothing Burger. Was it the inclusion of the same shit potato quests the base game had? Was it the new icon abilities that further bloat your move list that you can't fully utilize? Was it the story that still feels like fluff and could have never been seen and would not have changed anything? I'll admit I was curious what happened to the Leviathan user when playing through the base game, but this was so unsubstantial that I could have lived without it and been completely fine. The story content present isn't particularly bad, it's just not something that was worth 20 extra bucks on top of the 70 this game already was. I will admit that it was a neat story setup to have the icon be a baby that is frozen in time because they have sacrificed themselves to keep the tide in place, while the rest of their people stay in isolation from the rest of the world, completely unaware of everything else going on the outside. The highlights of this expansion is that the main area is really pretty. Like, wow, it's nice to see the sun again after what felt like 20 hours of purple skies. The scale of the set pieces and the cinematography are great, maybe that's what they're charging that extra money for, but my lord, is the DPS check in the final fight insanely tight. You basically need 100% uptime if you want to beat the boss before the enrage insta-kills you, which is pretty damn annoying to try and pull off when the boss actively pushes you miles away from it with this pulse attack. I don't know, man. I've cleared the first 3 fights of the current Savage tier. I like the skill and practice required to execute the metaphorical symphony of 8 players doing their rotation in harmony, but I don't really think having that in an action game is really fun. It works good in a GCD-based MMO, but it feels really restrictive to an already restrictive action game that would have been better off without cooldowns. The last thing you get is the Ultima Icon abilities. It's basically the big slashes from Bayonetta 2's Umbran Climax. Visually, its abilities are very pleasing to the eyes, but it's not one that I would really put any time into, especially with the loadout system currently in place. It sucks to end this video with me really down on the game. Maybe it's a combination of the honeymoon phase wearing off, so the combat issues really bother me, along with how weaker in quality the DLCs are compared to the base game. I really don't think they were worth the wait or the price of admission. I know I must sound like a broken record at this point, but I was well and truly tired of this game's approach to combat by the end. I don't like cooldowns in my action games, and I don't like how most of the enemies are unresponsive brick walls. I still really love the set pieces and the story of the base game. I think that alone is worth playing through. If you try the DLCs for yourself, maybe you'll get more out of them than I did. But for me, it seems like it's going to be a case of back-to-back Final Fantasy games that have great base games that I love and DLCs that I really dislike. Granted, Stranger of Paradise's DLCs have a whole wealth of completely different issues from the DLCs of this game. Making a game is extremely hard, and making a DLC to follow up a bombastic game like this must be even harder because they sure as hell do not get the time and money needed that the base game got. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you for watching as always. If you really liked the video, then please leave a like, comment, and share the video around. If you want to see more videos like this and support the channel, then maybe consider becoming a patron on Patreon, or now the newly added YouTube membership. All patrons and YouTube members get access to videos a day early, along with a $3 tier to allow you to vote on upcoming multi-game reviews, a $7 tier to view rough cuts of upcoming videos, and now I'm going to shout out all of my $5 and up patrons and members who really help support the channel. Vic Sauce, Valetti, Bully, Densha, Turbo Chicken, Scary Dinosaur, Burley, Chikun Highwind, Dev Welkin, Fishkami, Jordan Bennett, Kevin Velasquez, Kohai Carmen, Lotto, Maxi89C, Medi Not the Bad Guy, MGS Duh, Quartz, Samuel Egan, Sayin Hegi, Slemf Tingle, Vaso, Metal Cactus, Friday Night Fragging, Alec Joseph, Ben Johnson, Ben Olsberg, Buckets, Chichometrius, Cursed Void, Ek Frazo, Filthy Finger 69, Hardleg Joe, Jacob Hamilton, Leon, Nicholas Pedinato, Pittori Bursky, Sean the Berserker Fighter, Shisaji, Tabriz Sadiq, and Neutral Guy. Thanks so much, everyone. As for what's coming out next, I have a lot of videos still in the work. Probably the next thing to come out is going to be a review on Beyond Citadel, so hopefully you look forward to that and enjoy it. So as always, thank you for watching, and see you next time.